Hey guys, it's Thatcher again, and we're in part 2 of my film scanning tutorial. So in this video, we're going to be covering the post-processing aspect in which we go from this negative scan that represents transmittance that we made in the last video. Please watch that if you haven't already. And we're going to be going from that transmittance file to a positive, like a visually appealing JPEG image. We'll also caveat in one other way and say that this is just my current workflow that I use when processing my scans today with this scanner. I do expect that over time that this methodology will improve. And when that happens, I'll post another video on this channel. So go ahead and subscribe if you want to see that video in like 2 years. Here we are. We're still in the same Fusion composition as before. I do recommend that you should save these Fusion comps pretty early because sometimes Fusion has a tendency to crash. I'll call it postprocessing.comp. Just like in part 1, my post-processing pipeline is going to be using a lot of custom tools, right? These tools are all freely available on my GitHub, and I'll have that linked in the description below if you want to download any of these and run them yourself. So the first thing we're going to be doing is we are going to go ahead and load in our scans that we made earlier. So I'll go ahead and drag these in. I've kind of dragged in too many, I'll say, right? And we've got our large scans and our small scans. You see that the small scans load pretty quick, and it helps that they're only 60 megabytes instead of 250 megabytes. You can play with different compression algorithms if you have different storage space requirements and whatnot. Let's go ahead and play with the small scans. And it'll be important to also have our scan of the end of the film strip. The first thing that happens with film is that light has to pass through this orange colored base. And that's going to be affecting every single one of your shots. It's going to affect all the colors. This orange base is basically fixed in terms of density, and it represents the colored couplers that are within the film stock. So let's go ahead and divide this out so that we can get some proper colors, right? So I'm going to go ahead and use the color gain node, right? And we're going to be doing a similar trick that we did here, where we're going to be blurring so that we kind of can take an average of many pixels. I'll blur it maybe that much, right? And we're going to go ahead and enter in the color gain, 1.0 divided by the orange, right? So this is going to scale it up so that the D min corresponds to 1.0. So I'm going to do 1.0 divided by 0.4121, 1.0 divided by 0.16018. I'm reading these off of the bottom left corner, right? 1.0 divided by 0.09802. Okay, so we should see that the D min, this right portion here, is now scaled up to be sitting right at about 100%. Once we've removed this orange mask, we have to do a series of steps. I like to model my pipeline off of what a print system does. Now, that being said, this isn't like a perfect model of a print. Basically, we're approximating a print stock using just 1D curves. But the first thing that happens is that the print is going to be exposed to some amount of light, depending on your printer light settings. So there are many ways that you can approach this. One is that you can set up another color gain node, and you can mess with the red exposure or like the green exposure, via the gain controls. Another option that I personally use is I have a DCTL. This is my DCTL interpreter fuse. We are going to go ahead and use my printer lights DCTL that's in my utilities folder. What this is going to end up doing is it essentially applies like a linear gain adjustment. You can use this when adjusting digital images too, if you're so inclined. It expects essentially a linear input, right? I think strictly speaking, we want to set this negative gamma to 1 in this case. So strictly speaking, I did develop this tool for the purpose of digital color grading. So when you control the printer lights in a film printing setup, right, like 1 point corresponds to 0.025 log 10 units. But the amount of effect that this has on your image is really dependent on the gamma of the negative. So for the digital environment, I've assumed that your negative gamma is 0.5, so that 1 point corresponds to kind of the right amount of exposure. But in reality, we are working with a negative right now, so we're just going to set this to 1.0, okay? The only thing that this setting changes is how many printer light points that you have to move in order to get a certain effect. So truthfully, if you left it at 0.5, you're going to get the same results, okay? Alternatively, if you used color gain instead of using my fancy tool, you're also going to get the same results. It's all just about UI and what you want to work with, right? One trick that I use when I am grading an entire roll of stills is I'm going to go ahead and mark keyframes for all of these. Well, maybe not the bottom one. Then I'm going to go over to the end of the roll. In this case, it's, frame 1, right? I will also mark keyframes for all of these. And then I'll go over to keyframes down here. Once we've keyframed the first and last frames of our roll, we can actually fill in all the frames in between. I'll give you a little demo here. I'm going to imagine that the last frame was like frame 3, right? And we're going to go ahead and right click on one of these controls. We're going to export samples, right? So you save those somewhere. So it's going to be called DCTL Interpreter 1 Exposure Trim. Go ahead and replace that. And then we're going to import spline, and we're going to select that same one, hit open. And you can see up here that we now have a keyframe everywhere. I think we often have to like kind of scroll around a little bit, and then it gets updated here. So now you have a keyframe on all frames that represent this control. And then when we're going through frame by frame, we can go ahead and like, you know, bump this up and down or whatever, right? And then on the remaining frames, it will remain untouched. So that's kind of our little trick so that we can kind of use Fusion Studio as a generic color grading app for stills. In practice, I would repeat this process. If you want, you can skip the exporting part and we can just import the same spline for like each of these, right? But for the purpose of this tutorial, I only have like, you know, one frame, and truthfully, I can just take this and just like drag it over here and delete all this other stuff. So it's going to be within this tool that we make all of our exposure and balance adjustments on a shot-by-shot basis, right? The rest of the pipeline is going to be shared across all of the shots in the roll. Let's go ahead and name this node balance. And we'll go ahead and name that first one dmin, right? Good to be organized. The next tool we're going to be using is going to be my film curve DCTL. So we're going to go over to effects, and we're going to do film curve. Now, what does the film curve do? What we're going to try to do is we're going to try to represent the kind of the curve of a print stock. Strictly speaking, you don't have to actually model this after a specific print film stock. If you were to do that, I would recommend you probably turn off dmin because these print stocks are actually expect that orange tint to be present in the film, and they're balanced accordingly, right? But what I'm just going to do is I'm just basically going to use this as a curves tool and do what I want with these curves. So I've got some settings that I've already memorized. So we're going to set those to 5. We're going to set these to 0. We're going to set these to 5. So it's a pretty steep S-curve. And then, you know, there's some global adjustment stuff that you can make here. These kind of serve as like a base offset. But the reality is that, you know, by moving these like left and right, you know, you can get the same result using the printer lights is the fact of the matter. However, you know, if you have to make an adjustment to every single shot in the roll, you might as well do that here, right? Or if you want, you can do it in like a color gain node just upstream of this that is not keyframed. We also have an exposure gain. So I'm going to go ahead and lower the exposure gain down to here. We're going to turn off draw characteristic curve. You can see that we've already basically got a somewhat normalized image. Under the hood, what this film curve DCTL does is it's going to be following these 4 steps, right? So first, it's going to go from linear to exposure. So all that means is that it's going to take the code values outputted from our balance node, and we're just going to scale them by exposure gain, right? Because, you know, you can control how long the print stock is exposed to the printer, right? Next up, we're going to simply take the log 10 of the exposure, right? That gives us the x-axis that is shown on the characteristic curve plots of a print stock. We're going to apply that characteristic curve that you've drawn. In this case, it's going to be this one. You can also choose, you know, some other shapes if you were so inclined. And then once the characteristic curve is applied, the characteristic curve goes from log 10 exposure to density. We then have to convert from density to transmittance, right? So that's going to be this last step here. Let's go ahead and name this node film curve. Because the film curve returns the transmittance of this print, what we're going to be doing is we're going to do a color gain, and we will apply a gamma 2.2 for presentation for the display. Now, obviously right now it looks a little bit bright, so I think I'm going to raise the exposure of the print stock here so that we kind of get an appropriate result. So this is going to be gamma 2.2. And finally, we will rotate the image. I have a fuse called rotate image. And we go ahead and rotate it like this. Finally, we will save our results as a JPEG somewhere. So we'll call it scan post-processed.jpg like that. And if you want, you can like copy this pipeline and output small JPEGs as well as large ones or anything that you kind of choose. The nature of the beast at this point is that we are going to do some exposure adjustments on a shot-by-shot basis, maybe some balance adjustments, right? You will find that in general, the sliders kind of behave in maybe the opposite direction than you would expect. I think that is true of a film printer as well. So moving the red trim to the right will generally make it less red, will make it more cyan, and moving it to the left will make it more red, right? So you kind of have to look at each image and have an idea of like, oh, does this need more blue, less blue, you know, these sorts of things, right? So I think it's looking a little too blue to me right now, so I'm going to go ahead and yellow that up a touch, and maybe let's see, maybe bring it to around here. It does feel a little dark, so we're going to go ahead and maybe brighten it to there. Now, what we might end up concluding is that, oh, maybe there's too much contrast. So what I'm going to do is I will add a couple more nodes here, just to give us some more control. So I think one thing I will do is I'm going to offset down and make sure that our black point feels nice and black, right? So let's take a look at the waveform here. We can see that our black point floor is kind of sitting at like 7 or 8%, right? Yeah, it's at around 8%, right? So after the film curve, I'm going to go ahead and offset down. So you can use a custom tool for this, or, you know, like everything else, I have a DCTL. So we will go ahead and go to operations, addition function, and I'm going to subtract maybe this much. No, maybe we can go a little further. Kind of depends on what sort of vibe you really want. You definitely don't want to go too far though, because that'll kind of cook your image a little bit. So maybe we'll go like that, a little bit of an offset down kind of adjustment. So we'll call this offset. And that's going to kind of compensate for the flare that, you know, we're sort of simulating in the system. And yeah, the other final thing that you might notice is that, you know, maybe you feel that this image doesn't have quite enough contrast. Obviously, this balance, you know, in a real film pipeline, you can't really control the contrast that much after the fact, except by developing like the print for longer, or perhaps your interpositive or whatever, right? But I do have a tool that we can showcase called linear contrast, which will kind of allow us to do some contrast adjustments. So if we're looking at it right now, we can kind of see that, you know, maybe the middle intensity, this whole thing, maybe 0.4-ish, maybe 0.5, right? So I'm going to go ahead and lie to it, say mid-gray is 0.5. The mid-gray slider here is going to represent the pivot point. And then otherwise, it's going to be using a power function like x to this power, right, in order to control the contrast. So we're going to monitor the final image. Let's bump this up. See, we can see that we get some more contrast if we move that to the right. Get less contrast if we move it to the left, right? And we're gonna raise the contrast to taste to, you know, maybe there. Maybe that's good. And we'll just share that across all the images. So suppose maybe that's my final scan. I'm gonna go ahead and immediately just swap it out for the larger one. And we should see any second now. There we go. So we've got our scan. It's 7,500 pixels wide and 10,000 pixels tall. And all we have to do at this point is just hit render, and we can render it out as a JPEG. So we'll just go ahead and do that. And yeah, now all we have to do is we can pull up our JPEG over here. We'll look at it. Looks pretty much the same on both sides, which is always a happy feeling. And yeah, now all we have to do is upload this to the internet and post it to Instagram and get all the likes that we can. All right, so that concludes part 2 of the tutorial. That kind of shows you the entire pipeline that I used. I will caveat one more time that, you know, it's inspired by print films, right? Like, you know, we give you similar controls as what you would have in a print film environment. Print films have their own dye mechanics, and they have their own spectral sensitivities, which may differ from my scanners. Print stocks also have like inter-image effects and whatnot, so they have some color correction capabilities built within them that obviously this pipeline did not showcase. However, I will say that if you have a similar scanner, or if you're scanning in some kind of context in which your effective spectral sensitivities are pretty narrow and kind of correspond to each of the dyes, you should be able to find yourself getting good results using this method. using this approach, I have not yet run into any crazy scenarios where like there's like a red that's like super saturated and it feels like, you know, it's darker than like the surrounding black areas, or maybe there's some saturated color behind like a light leak or a fog, and somehow it's like it's gone too saturated, and you can really feel those problems. So my lead has just run out of juice, so I think it's time to wrap the video up right now. If you guys have any suggestions as to what I should change in this pipeline, or if you have any tweaks that you've made that have made it even better, please let me know in the comments below. And I hope that you guys all have an excellent day. Have a good one, guys.